It was the kind of rain that never quite decided whether to fall with earnestness or simply linger in the air like a damp memory. Oxford had been muffled that morning, the bells reduced to a hollow resonance, the pavements glistening beneath a sky the colour of tarnished pewter. I had walked without hurry across the quad, the usual ache in my knee answering each slick stone step, until I found myself before the library doors. They opened, with that reluctant creak I had always admired, as if books themselves resisted intrusion, wanting the silence to last. Inside, the air was thick with the fragrance of paper, dust, and something faintly medicinal. I have always found comfort in such atmospheres. They promise permanence, even if permanence is only another form of illusion. The librarian, a thin woman whose spectacles perched like a rebuke upon her nose, acknowledged me with the barest incline of the head. She had once told me that detectives made her uneasy. She did not say it unkindly, but as one might comment on a draught through a window, inconvenient, unavoidable. I took it as a compliment. I sat at a table by the window, watching the drops collect in irregular races upon the glass. Someone had left a half-finished crossword folded beneath an abandoned copy of the Times. I picked it up, more out of habit than curiosity. The clue that caught my attention read, "Silent Scholar's Hidden Truth." 7. I toyed with the letters in my mind. Liberate was the word that eventually came. To balance, to weigh, an imperfect fit, yet one that lingered. Silent Scholar, Hidden Truth. It was, perhaps, a clue intended only for me. Lewis arrived late, shaking the damp from his coat, the expression on his face bearing equal measures of apology and mild irritation. He murmured that the station had called. A death unexpected, though they never truly are otherwise. I listened without replying. The library had wrapped itself around me with its fragile gravity, and I found it difficult to let go. The man had been a fellow of one of the smaller colleges, Lewis continued, his body discovered in the reading room, slumped across a table not unlike the one at which I now sat. Heart failure, the attending doctor suggested, but the circumstances unsettled them. A folded note in his hand, illegible now, the ink blurred by spilled tea. A peculiar stillness in the room, as though something were waiting. I closed the crossword and looked back to the rain. Even in death, men choose libraries. Or perhaps libraries choose them. We walked together through the quadrangle, our coats absorbing the drizzle with quiet resignation. Lewis asked whether I believed in accidents. I answered that I believed in inevitability, which is rarely the same thing. He frowned, not for the first time, at what he doubtless considered evasiveness. When we reached the reading room, it smelled faintly of extinguished candles. The fellow lay still upon the oak, his skin pale with that peculiar waxen translucence only the recently departed possess. His spectacles remained upon his nose, crooked but intact, and his hand clenched the sodden paper. I leaned over, noting the way the fingers pressed too tightly, as if the grasp had outlived the man himself. Lewis observed the spilled tea darkened against the wood. He muttered something about carelessness, about how easily a cup might topple when one leaned forward. I said nothing. Instead, I glanced at the window. It was open a fraction, though no one admitted to opening it. Rain had entered, peppering the sill. On the ledge, almost imperceptible, a trace of mud. Shoes had been there, recently. I asked the librarian whether the fellow had enemies. She stiffened. In Oxford, the word enemy is always considered vulgar. Rivalries, disputes, yes. Enemies, never. She mentioned a quarrel over manuscripts, a dispute about access to a particular archive. Petty, she insisted. I nodded, though I doubted pettiness ever remains petty for long. Lewis found a watch in the fellow's pocket, stopped at precisely 11 minutes past 9. A coincidence, perhaps, but I found myself repeating the time as though it mattered. 11 minutes past 9. The bells had not rung, then I would have heard them across the quad. Rain had been falling. That too might mean something. I sat down at the chair opposite the dead man, as though entering into some final, unspoken tutorial. His expression, faintly strained, suggested effort rather than pain. The note in his hand, blurred but not beyond recognition, seemed to contain a single word. I thought I could make out the letters L and I, perhaps R, librate, balance. Again the word returned to me, like an echo across stone halls. Lewis asked what I thought. I told him that I thought the dead never lie, but they seldom speak plainly. He sighed, knowing too well that I enjoyed the luxury of ambiguity. The rain grew heavier, hammering against the glass. A small draught slipped beneath the library doors. The librarian fussed with the lamps, her movements too quick, as though to busy herself against intrusion. I wondered whether she too had noticed the mud upon the sill. We left the reading room after the body was removed, the silence broken only by the shuffle of reluctant feet. Outside, the college grounds swam with puddles. Students hurried with their heads lowered, their books clasped as though shields. I envied them for their illusions of permanence. Lewis asked where we ought to begin. I said we had already begun, though I wasn't certain he understood. In such cases, the beginning rarely announces itself. It lurks in half-finished crosswords, in rain-soaked notes, in windows opened by unseen hands. As we crossed the high street, a bus sent up a wave of water that nearly caught us both. Lewis cursed under his breath. I, however, found myself staring at the droplets trembling on the hem of my coat, forming patterns not unlike letters, R perhaps, or L. Perhaps nothing at all. Later, alone in my flat, I poured a measure of whiskey and set the glass upon the desk beside a stack of neglected opera recordings. I thought again of the clue, silent scholar's hidden truth. 7 letters, librate, or perhaps another word altogether. Silence conceals more than it reveals, but every library whispers if one listens long enough. That night, as the city continued to drown gently beneath its curtain of rain, I felt the first glimmer of something shifting. A balance unsettled, a truth obscured, but not indefinitely. And though I could not yet name it, I knew it had already begun to reach for me, as insistent as the sound of water against stone. St. Anselm's was not a college that wore its history comfortably. It was small, austere, tucked into a corner where tourists rarely wandered, and its buildings seemed to apologize for their own existence. Stone darkened by centuries of drizzle, windows too narrow to admit more than a thread of light. I had visited often enough in the past, though never with any pleasure. That morning, the corridors smelled faintly of chalk, damp wool, and something medicinal, as though illness clung invisibly to the walls. The porter had greeted us with his customary blend of wariness and ritual courtesy. He spoke of the fellow's absence from morning prayers, the raised eyebrows it had provoked, and the eventual discovery of the death that now weighed down the whole institution. His voice carried no grief, only obligation, as though recounting the items of lost property rather than a man's life. Lewis walked beside me in silence, his gaze drawn to the notice boards pinned with curling timetables, forgotten debates, and appeals for lost umbrellas. He asked whether I thought the college atmosphere itself could kill a man. I answered that it had killed many, though usually more slowly, and through other instruments. He laughed, without pleasure. We reached the fellow's rooms at the end of a long, echoing passage. The door was ajar. I pushed it wider and entered, the sound of my shoes against the flagstones amplified into something that seemed accusatory. Inside, the air carried the familiar library odor of leather bindings and paper, but with an added note of stale smoke the kind left when one has extinguished a cigarette too quickly. The desk dominated the room. It was excessively tidy. Books aligned with mathematical precision, pens arranged like surgical tools, blotting paper crisp and unsullied. What struck me was not what was there, but what was not. No half-written lecture notes, no letters in progress, no hint of interruption, only the absence itself, humming like a taut string. Lewis bent to examine the wastepaper basket. Empty. He frowned. No drafts, no discarded letters, no crossword clippings, nothing to suggest that a man had worked, or erred, or lived. An empty basket in a scholar's room is as unlikely as an unsmudged sleeve. In a painter's studio, it spoke, though in whispers. I ran my finger along the desk edge, pausing at a faint groove. A line etched shallowly into the wood, as if a hand had pressed too hard while writing, or perhaps carved with intention. Letters? Numbers? I traced them with a matchstick from my pocket. The shape resolved itself into 3 characters. Not words, but initials AR. They meant nothing to me then, but they lodged themselves in my mind with the persistence of a half-remembered tune. On the mantel stood a photograph in a tarnished frame. It showed the fellows seated among colleagues, their smiles stiff, their postures arranged as though joy were an examination to be passed. Behind them, ivy blurred into shadow. I studied their eyes, the way 1 or 2 glanced not at the camera but sideways toward the fellow himself. Admiration, perhaps, or suspicion. Human expressions rarely belong entirely to one category. Lewis coughed, impatient. He had found a timetable pinned beside the wardrobe, marked with faint pencil strokes. Thursdays circled twice. I asked him which day it was now. He told me Thursday. We stood together in silence, as though the day itself were an accomplice. I sat briefly in the fellow's chair. It sagged under my weight, complaining softly. From that vantage, the room appeared different. The alignment of books on the shelves, the particular angle of the lamp, the proximity of the window, which had been left open just enough to invite rain. The sill bore another faint trace of mud, identical to that I had seen in the library. Shoes again, shoes that walked from one sanctum to another, unnoticed. Lewis wondered aloud whether the mud might belong to the porter, or some careless student. I shook my head. Carelessness rarely repeats itself with such symmetry. He muttered that I was seeing patterns where none existed. I replied, more to myself than to him, that life is nothing but a pattern, and death is the disruption of it. We opened the drawers of the desk. They contained only the expected bills, receipts, and a small box of matches. Yet the matches were peculiar. Each had been broken neatly in half, the heads still intact. I held one between my fingers, considering, why break them? A nervous habit, a private ritual, or a message? Lewis shrugged. To him, a match was a match. To me, they formed another silent line of letters waiting to be arranged into sense. The bed was made with military precision, no indentation, no evidence of restless nights, the curtains drawn back just so. It was a room that had erased itself, presenting only an illusion of order. Yet the absence shouted louder than disorder ever could. As we prepared to leave, I noticed a small envelope wedged behind a volume of Cicero. It was empty, though the faint impression of a seal remained. Whoever had taken the letter had been careful enough to remove its contents, but careless enough to leave the husk. AR again, pressed faintly into the wax. The initials returned, circling like a bird unwilling to land. Outside, the corridor was colder. Students passed us with their muted laughter, eyes skimming us like stones skipping water. They knew something had happened, but their youth protected them from caring deeply. Lewis asked where the investigation should go next. I told him that sometimes an empty desk tells us more than a cluttered one. He raised his eyebrows, waiting for elaboration. I gave him none. My deductions are often less than fully formed, at first fragments of melody rather than symphonies. Yet already I felt the tune was one I had heard before, faint and distant. The rain began again as we stepped into the quad. St. Anselm's bell tolled the hour. 11 minutes past 9 had returned to my thoughts, the watch in the dead man's pocket, frozen at that time, and the envelope marked with initials he had never explained, a library, a desk, a matchbox. Each spoke softly, yet together they began to hum with the promise of coherence. I paused beneath the cloister arch, watching the rain collect in silver threads against the stone. Patterns again, always patterns. Somewhere between the empty desk and the broken matches lay the truth of a man's death, though at that moment it remained concealed, as stubborn and elusive as a crossword clue half solved in the margins of the Times. The invitation to dine with the Fellows of St. Anselm's arrived not through courtesy but through inevitability. When death intrudes upon an institution, it demands acknowledgement, even if only in the form of roast beef and indifferent claret. Oxford, after all, has always preferred to discuss tragedy with a knife and fork in hand. Lewis accompanied me reluctantly, his tie pulled too tight, his patience already frayed. The college hall was dimly lit, candles arranged in strict lines along the length of the table, their flames bending in the draught that slipped through the ancient windows. The air smelt of starch, port, and a faint undercurrent of mildew. The fellows gathered like actors uncertain of their lines, their gowns whispered as they moved, their eyes darted towards me and then away again, and they knew why I had come, though no one wished to articulate it. Oxford thrives on silences more than on speeches. Dinner began with soup so thin it might have been an apology. The conversation, too, was thin. Scraps of Latin, murmured references to lectures, a joke about funding that was not intended to amuse. I sipped at the wine and let their words wash over me like the indistinct murmurs of a distant choir. What mattered was not what they said, but what they avoided. One fellow, a man with hair prematurely white and spectacles perched low on his nose, leaned toward me to remark that the deceased had always been peculiar about his work. Obsessive, he said, in the way a collector grows obsessive about stamps or butterflies. His tone carried disdain, yet also envy. Across the table, another fellow, younger and sharpied, interjected that genius always borders on obsession, and that the college had benefited from the man's meticulousness. Their words collided gently, like raindrops meeting upon glass, but the silence that followed was heavier than either had intended. Lewis tried to break it by asking after the fellow's routine. Did he keep to his rooms? Did he have visitors? A third man, stout and flushed from drink, replied that he kept largely to himself. Except Thursdays, he added, when he attended certain discussions in the old cloister. What discussions? The stout man waved a hand. Historical papers, theological disputes, the sort of academic theatre no one outside cared about. I let my gaze drift along the table, observing more than listening. Hands fidgeted with napkins, forks tapped against porcelain. One woman, the only female fellow present, kept her eyes lowered, though once, when the talk turned again to manuscripts, she glanced up sharply, almost involuntarily. It was a look that lasted no longer than a heartbeat, yet it told me more than words could. She knew something, or feared something. The main course arrived, slabs of beef that bled reluctantly beneath the knife. I cut slowly, thinking of the initials carved into the dead man's desk. A.R. I considered each face at the table, each syllable of their names, listening for resonance. None declared itself, though the younger fellow's surname began with an R. Too easy, I thought, too close to the surface. Lewis leaned toward me to mutter that this was a waste of time. I told him softly that no time is wasted where silences are concerned. He frowned, returned to his meal, and left me to mine. As the plates were cleared, dessert appeared treacle tart with cream thick enough to drown in. I ate little. My attention was on the conversation that finally found momentum in wine. Someone mentioned the fellow's insistence on punctuality, his lectures beginning at precisely 9 minutes past the hour. Not 10, not 5, always 9 past. The hall chuckled indulgent, though I felt the details strike against me like a tuning fork. 9 past the hour. His watch had stopped at 11 minutes past 9. Coincidence, perhaps. Or perhaps his life had been ordered by the tyranny of minutes. The woman finally spoke. Her voice was low but steady. She remarked that the deceased had been restless of late, more withdrawn than usual, and that he had seemed burdened by a decision. She would not elaborate. Others shifted uncomfortably as though she had crossed an unspoken boundary. The stout man coughed into his glass. The younger one adjusted his cufflinks too often. Small gestures, but each louder to me than their words. The port circulated, dark and sweet, heavy with tradition. I let it linger on my tongue, its warmth masking the cold thought forming at the back of my mind. Obsession with time, with order, with secrecy. A desk too, neat, matches broken in half, a window left ajar. Each piece was small, but together they began to form the outline of something larger, something that refused yet to declare itself fully. Lewis asked if we might leave. His patience for academic rituals was always thinner than mine. I nodded, though slowly, still watching the faces at the table. The younger fellow laughed too loudly at a passing jest. The woman's eyes followed us as we rose. The white-haired scholar refilled his glass almost immediately, as though to blot out thought. Outside the rain had ceased, leaving the flagstones glistening beneath the moon. The air was colder, sharper, carrying the scent of wet stone and extinguished candles. Lewis asked what I had learned. I told him very little, which was almost true, for it was not knowledge I carried away from that dinner, but an impression, a weight of silence, the fragile tremor of fear behind the eyes of scholars who prided themselves on composure. As we crossed the quad, I recalled the crossword clue from days before, silent scholars' hidden truth. I had thought of liberate, but perhaps it was another word altogether. Perhaps it was silence itself that concealed, and the truth waited, patient, beneath layers of ritual and wine. The hall behind us darkened as the candles burned low, the laughter fading into stone. Ahead, the cloister stretched into shadow. I felt, though I could not yet explain, that the path toward the truth would lead us there. It was late afternoon when I returned to the fellows' rooms, the corridors of St. Anselm's echoing faintly with the shuffle of departing lectures. The light had grown hesitant, filtering through tall, reluctant windows and falling across the oak floorboards in pale ribbons. There was a stillness about the place, not quite silence, but the residue of words recently spoken and already forgotten. I had asked Lewis to fetch the photograph we had noticed on the mantel during our earlier visit. He carried it now with the care one affords to fragile evidence, though his expression suggested that to him it was nothing more than another piece of college paraphernalia. He set it upon the desk, and we studied it together in the fading light. The image showed the fellows assembled in their customary rows, stiff as chessmen, faces arranged into the approximations of cordiality. At the centre sat the deceased, his posture precise, his gaze fixed beyond the camera as though already distracted by some private calculus. But what drew my attention was not him. Behind the row of scholars, half obscured by ivy, stood a woman. not a fellow, not a servant, not anyone whose presence could be explained easily. Her features were blurred, not by movement, but by distance, yet her gaze was unmistakably direct, fixed upon the lens with a calmness that unsettled. She did not belong, and in Oxford the presence of one who does not belong is never accidental. Lewis squinted and remarked that she might have been a passer-by. I shook my head. Passers-by do not linger behind groups posed for posterity. They move on. She had remained deliberately, and the photographer had not thought or dared to remove her. That choice, too, mattered. I examined the frame itself, tracing the edge with my fingers. At the back, faint scratches marked the wood, the initials again. AR scored lightly, as though by a careless hand or a nervous one. The recurrence was no longer a coincidence. A name hovered just out of reach, the way a crossword answer does when the letters are there but the mind resists. Lewis asked whether we should show the photograph to the other fellows. I told him not yet. To present a piece too soon is to ruin the puzzle. Better to hold it until the right moment, when silence can no longer protect those who wish to keep it. We left the room and walked into the quad. Evening had descended with a softness that belied its chill. The rain had ceased, leaving the stone damp and shining, the air heavy with the smell of wet ivy. I carried the photograph beneath my coat, feeling its weight disproportionate to its size. Later, in my own rooms, I placed it beneath the lamp and studied the woman again. Something about her stance troubled me. Her shoulders tilted slightly, her hands hidden in the folds of her dress. It was a posture of waiting, of restraint. I searched her face for recognition, but memory failed me. She might have been anyone or no one at all. I poured a measure of whiskey and sat with the crossword from that morning's paper. One clue had been left unfinished. Veiled presence lingers at the edge 5. The letters offered themselves shade, ghost, wraith, none satisfied. I wrote in ghost, knowing even as I did that it was wrong. Sometimes a clue resists because it demands not a word, but a memory. The photograph itself was the clue, and the answer for the moment remained hidden. Lewis telephoned that evening, his voice carrying more impatience than usual. He wanted progress, a direction. I told him of the woman, and he exhaled loudly down the line. A figure in the background, he said, could mean nothing. I reminded him that in Oxford nothing is ever nothing. He did not reply. After I hung up, I returned to the photograph, tilting it beneath the lamplight. A glimmer revealed itself in the corner of an envelope, just visible in the deceased's pocket. Not part of the man himself, but preserved in the frozen moment of the image. A letter he had carried, unopened, or perhaps too carefully kept. The letter we had found missing from his desk. The empty envelope marked AR. The photograph had captured its existence, if not its meaning. The woman's gaze seemed to grow sharper the longer I looked. She was not smiling, not even faintly. It was a gaze without warmth, without malice either, as if she had already accepted the inevitability of what the others refused to see. A witness, perhaps, or something more. The night outside pressed close against the window, the city subdued into darkness. I found myself thinking of the time again, 11 minutes past 9. The fellow's strange ritual of beginning lectures at 9 past the hour. The watch in his pocket, arrested at that very moment. A pattern insisted on asserting itself, though I could not yet articulate it. I closed my eyes and listened to the creaks of the building, the slow settling of wood and stone. Memory works in the same way, shifting, settling, revealing. Somewhere in the recess of my mind I felt the first stirrings of recognition. A face glimpsed once before, perhaps at another lecture, another gathering, another Oxford evening blurred by wine and routine. but certainty is the enemy of truth. Better to leave it unresolved, at least for now. The photograph remained on my desk, its surface reflecting the glow of the lamp, the woman's shadow presence waiting with patience I could not match. She would not tell her secret yet, but she had already told me enough. That night I dreamt of rain falling across old stones, footsteps in corridors, of a desk too neat and a note too blurred to read. But above all, I dreamt of eyes that watched from the background, calm and unyielding, as though they had been waiting for me all along. I have always found crosswords to be less a pastime than a confession. Each clue demands not knowledge, but a kind of surrender, the recognition that language bends, fractures, and hides itself in plain sight. The fellow had understood this, I think. His life had been a crossword, precise, deliberate, and filled with clues no one had the patience to solve. It was a grey morning when Lewis arrived at my flat with a bundle of papers. They had been gathered from the deceased's rooms after a second search. At first glance they were ordinary enough lecture notes, library requests, receipts for bookbinders and tailors. Yet folded within them lay a series of crosswords, torn from newspapers and completed in a hand neat but restless. Lewis dismissed them with a shrug. "Everyone in Oxford does the crossword," he muttered. "I told him that everyone in Oxford also drinks tea, yet no one dies with a teacup spilling across their final words without reason." He sighed, accustomed to my obliqueness, and left me to my puzzles. I spread the pages across the desk, aligning them like fragments of a larger manuscript. The clues filled me with that peculiar unease which comes when words appear to point at something beyond themselves. One puzzle in particular bore markings heavier than the rest, as though the pen had pressed too firmly. Across the top, a phrase ran almost completely, "balance of silence." The letters had been circled, not once, but several times. Balance, silence. I felt the echo of the word liberate return to me insistently. Lewis peered over my shoulder. "Perhaps he just liked the words," he said. "Perhaps. But I have never believed in preference when it comes to obsession. Words are chosen, not liked. They reveal as much as they conceal." The room grew darker with the clouds, and I lit the lamp. The crosswords glowed faintly beneath its yellow light. I noticed then that several letters had been written in pencil rather than ink. At first they seemed random, but when isolated they spelled three initials. A.R. again. The ghost that would not depart. Lewis frowned. "You're seeing patterns," he said. I told him that life was nothing but a pattern. He muttered that death was the absence of it. I did not reply. Some truths do not require answers. I studied one particular clue. "Scholar hides truth in chaotic rain, 6. The answer he had written was Luthra, not a word, unless I thought it was a name disguised as one. I rearranged the letters. Author. There it was, a scholar hides the truth from the author. The clue was no longer play but declaration. Someone had written themselves into the crossword, quietly, where only a patient eye might notice. Later that day, we visited the library again. The rain had returned, gentle but persistent, dripping from the eaves in long threads. The librarian watched me warily as I spread the crosswords upon the table. She asked what they meant. I told her they were having a conversation. She did not laugh. Instead, she adjusted her spectacles and turned away, as though unwilling to listen. Lewis walked the perimeter of the room, restless. He complained that words would not bring us closer to the truth. Yet as he passed beneath the high window, I saw him pause. The mud upon the sill had dried to dust, but a faint imprint remained, not of a shoe but of a hand, fingers splayed pressed into the damp stone, not entry, but balance, as one might steady themselves while leaning to watch. A watcher. I told him so. He looked at me with that familiar exasperation. "You can't build a case on smudges and puzzles," he said. I replied that cases are built on nothing else. The crossword pages lay between us like maps of an uncharted country. Balance, silence. Author, AR. Each fragment is a signpost, though none yet revealed the destination. We left the library in silence. Outside, the bells marked the hour, their resonance rolling through the damp air. 11 minutes passed again, always that time. A ritual repeating itself, whether in life or death. Back in my flat that evening, I attempted the day's crossword from the paper. The clue that caught me was simple. Still life without fruit for, I considered it. Poem, work, icon, none fitted, and the word came dead, 4 letters, plain, cruel, exact. I wrote it in with a firmness that surprised even me. The whiskey in my glass caught the lamplight, reflecting the pages spread across the desk. Crosswords, crossed words, words that had been written, erased, rearranged, words that formed initials, names, perhaps accusations. The dead man had been speaking, and his language was one only silence could amplify. I leaned back, listening to the rain as it returned against the glass. Somewhere beyond Oxford's sodden streets, a woman in a photograph still watched, patient, unyielding. And beneath her gaze, the crosswords whispered their unfinished sentences. Balance, silence, author, A.R. The puzzle continued, and I, for once, felt less the solver than the solved. Her name returned to me first as a murmur, a syllable half-formed, coaxed from the depths of memory by the woman in the photograph. Eleanor. The sound of it brought with it a damp evening years before, a lecture I had attended more out of boredom than diligence, and a voice that had carried conviction through a hall that otherwise reeked of indifference. Eleanor, a scholar who had never quite belonged, yet whose presence could not be denied. When she appeared again, it was in the most ordinary of fashions, stepping lightly into the cloister as though she had only just returned from an errand. I had been standing with Lewis, reviewing notes that seemed to resist coherence, when her figure approached across the stone passageway, her footsteps steady, her eyes untroubled by our scrutiny. She offered a nod, not of greeting, but of acknowledgment, as though she had anticipated our presence. Lewis muttered that he thought she had left Oxford years ago. He said it with the tone of a man repeating rumour rather than fact. I replied only that some departures are never as complete as they appear. We followed her into the hall, where she sat at one of the long oak tables, her hands folded neatly, a book resting unopened before her. I asked if she had known the deceased. She smiled faintly as if at a private recollection, and said that everyone at St. Anselm's knew him, though few could claim friendship. Her voice retained the clarity I remembered, low but resonant, the kind that could outlast silence without effort. She spoke of him as meticulous, obsessed with structure, with rules. A man who believed order could preserve truth. Yet she added, order is a fragile shield. Her eyes lingered on me when she said it, as though daring me to contradict. I did not. Lewis asked where she had been, why she had not attended the dinners or the meetings in recent months. Eleanor's gaze drifted briefly toward the cloister windows, where rain pressed against the glass in patient intervals. She replied that absence was sometimes safer than presence. The answer was neither evasive nor complete. It was then that I noticed her hands. They bore faint stains, not of ink but of chalk, the kind used still in certain lecture halls where tradition resisted progress. Chalk stains at a dinner hour. I asked her what she had been lecturing on. She paused, as though the question itself surprised her. Latin elegies, she said at last, Poems of Exile and Return. The word return hung between us like a candle guttering in a draught. Lewis seemed impatient with her ambiguity, but I felt a subtle alignment beginning to take shape. The initials AR, the letters hidden within the crosswords, the photograph with her blurred figure. Author, return. Eleanor herself had returned, but for what purpose, and at what cost? We parted after a time, she with a courteous inclination of the head, as though concluding a seminar, and we with our silence. Outside, the rain had begun again, slicking the flagstones until they reflected the cloister arches in trembling duplicates. Back in my room that night, I spread the crossword pages across the desk once more. One clue I had overlooked revealed itself with fresh insistence. She comes back quietly, bearing truth. 7, the deceased, had written re-entry, then crossed it out. Above it he had written Eleanor, faintly, almost unwillingly. I stared at the letters until the lamp blurred. The puzzle was no longer abstract. It had acquired flesh, voice, and footsteps. I poured whiskey into the glass, the sound loud against the stillness, and considered the shape of the evening. Eleanor had returned, whether as witness, as guardian, or as something else entirely, I could not yet discern. But her presence altered the balance, as rain alters the reflection of a building in the river, the same and not the same. I thought again of her hands, the chalk smudges against her skin, the unspoken lecture in her silence. I thought of the way her gaze had fixed not on Lewis, nor on the memory of the dead, but on me, as though she expected me to piece together the fragments she herself refused to offer. Oxford lay subdued outside my window, the lamps glimmering faintly through rain-soaked air, the sound of bicycles echoing in deserted streets. I set the glass down and returned to the crossword. Eleanor. A name, a clue, a return, and perhaps in time an answer. I had always suspected that wills told less about a man's affections than about his grievances. They are rarely declarations of love. More often, they are instruments of correction, the last opportunity to rebalance what life left skewed. The fellow's will, when it was finally produced, confirmed my suspicion. Lewis and I sat with the solicitor in an office that smelt of dust, ink, and the faint sweetness of polish applied long ago. The man was pale, almost transparent, his voice thin as paper. He unfolded the document with the care of a priest opening scripture. His words, however, were plain enough modest bequests to the college, a scattering of small sums to distant relations, and one significant portion reserved for a name I did not expect. Eleanor. Lewis shifted beside me, his brow furrowed. He whispered that it proved the motive. I shook my head. Motive is never proven so easily, especially when it comes dressed in the obvious. A bequest can be gratitude, punishment, or a red herring left to mislead those too impatient to question it. I asked the solicitor when the will had been drawn. He tapped the date with a bony finger, precisely 9 months prior. 9 months. A neat interval, the span of gestation. Birth of something, or the quiet burial of something else. The timing mattered, though how I could not yet say. Afterward, we walked across the high street, the air heavy with drizzle that blurred the lamps into trembling halos. Lewis muttered about Eleanor again, about how her sudden return and her sudden inheritance could not be coincidental. I told him that coincidence is Oxford's preferred disguise. He asked if I trusted her. I answered that trust had never been part of my trade. We returned to the fellow's rooms, hoping perhaps for some overlooked scrap that would explain the bequest. The desk was as empty as before, the drawers meticulous, the matches still broken neatly in half. Yet as I leaned against the shelves, a slip of paper fell from between 2 volumes. It was a crossword clue clipped from a newspaper. The edges were frayed, the ink blurred, but the words remained gift concealed in guise for. Lewis guessed the answer was will. I considered it. Will fit, certainly. Yet so did boon or even alms. The clue offered too many paths, which made it less a solution than a riddle. Still, I pocketed it, for riddles often speak when evidence refuses. That evening we dined again with several fellows in the hall. The atmosphere was tighter than before, conversation constrained by the shadow of the will. One of them remarked too quickly that Eleanor's name had surprised him. Another, the stout man, insisted it was natural, given her assistance with manuscripts. Their disagreement was mild, but the silences that followed were not. I watched Eleanor carefully. She ate with deliberate calm, her fork steady, her gaze lowered. Yet once, when Lewis mentioned the word inheritance, her hand paused just long enough above the plate for me to notice. A hesitation, the kind that betrays more than an outright denial. After dinner, I spoke with her briefly in the cloister. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of rain upon stone. She said that she had never asked for anything, that the fellow had been insistent, that she had even tried to dissuade him. Her words were measured, but her eyes betrayed fatigue. Whether from truth or from performance, I could not tell. Lewis asked later if I believed her. I told him that belief was irrelevant. What mattered was that the will pointed too directly, too openly. Real motives rarely arrive so neatly wrapped. Red herrings, however, do. Back in my room, I spread the clue across the desk. Gift concealed in guise, 4 letters. I rearranged them slowly, boon and alms. Yet one word lingered longer than the others. Guilt. Not a gift, but guilt, something that appears golden, but is not. A false inheritance, perhaps. A bequest, not of wealth, but of burden. The whiskey burned as I swallowed, and outside, the rain began again, falling with that peculiar Oxford rhythm that seemed always to mark endings and beginnings alike. The will, I thought, had been written to mislead. Whether by the deceased himself or by the silence that survived him, I could not yet discern. But I knew these red herrings, like broken matches and blurred notes, have their place in puzzles. They exist to delay, to distract, to weary the impatient. And yet beneath them the pattern remains, waiting for the one willing to endure the silence long enough to see it. That night, I dreamed of golden letters peeling into dust, of signatures blurred by rain, of Eleanor's eyes lingering not with greed, but with sorrow. And when I woke, I could still hear the faint whisper of the clue, repeating itself like the tolling of the bells, gift concealed in guise. Gift concealed in guise, 4 letters, and never quite what it seemed. The archive of St. Anselm's was never meant to invite visitors. It lay beneath the oldest wing of the college, a place of low ceilings and damp stone, where the smell of mildew clung stubbornly to the air. When the librarian handed me the iron key, her fingers lingered longer than necessary, as if reluctant to surrender what ought not to be touched. She warned of draughts, of poor lighting, of dust thick enough to smother patience itself. Her words were not warnings but obstructions. Lewis and I descended the stair, each step hollow, echoing as though the walls themselves disapproved. The air cooled as we went, and by the time we reached the heavy oak door, my breath left a pale mist in the lamp's glow. Lewis muttered that there was no place for scholarship. I answered that truth often preferred shadows to light. Inside, shelves sagged beneath the weight of centuries, their spines cracked, their bindings mottled with age. The lamp revealed only fragments of titles, Latin mottos half erased by damp. I ran my fingers along them as one might trace headstones, the texture brittle, the silence immense. We searched for nothing in particular, and yet for everything. The fellow's obsession with manuscripts had been mentioned more than once, and it was here, in this subterranean vault, that obsession would have taken root. Lewis busied himself with catalogues, muttering about handwriting impossible to decipher. I allowed my eyes to wander, following instinct rather than system. It was instinct that drew me to the shelf farthest from the light, where cobwebs clung like veils. There, wedged between two crumbling folios, lay a manuscript bound not in leather but in plain cloth, its edges stained, its title absent. I drew it free, and the dust rose in a sigh. We carried it to the desk, its surface scarred with generations of impatient quills. The manuscript opened reluctantly, its spine resisting until it cracked faintly. Within, the handwriting was unmistakable. The fellows, neat, deliberate, unadorned. Not notes, not lectures, but a translation. Latin verses rendered into English, their meaning austere and mournful, poems of exile, of silence, of secrets kept at cost. Lewis skimmed a page and shrugged. "Just poetry," he said. I shook my head. No translation is ever just translation. It is choice, it is emphasis, it is the quiet confession of what one finds important. I read a line aloud. She returns, but the door remembers the silence. The word returns lingered. Eleanor's return. Again the echo. At the back of the manuscript, pressed between pages, lay an envelope. Empty, but for a faint imprint on the paper, as though something had been removed hurriedly. The wax seal was broken. The initials AR had been pressed once more into the residue. The ghost initials, always there, always at the margins. Lewis scowled. A will, a photograph, crosswords, and now poetry. He asked what it amounted to. I told him it amounted to shadow. He cursed under his breath and turned away, his patience thinning. I, however, felt the weight of the manuscript as something heavier than paper. The fellow had been translating his own fear into words. I examined the margin of one page where the ink had been darker, pressed harder. A single word underlined twice author, the same that had emerged from the crossword, the same that refused to release me. Author of what? His own silence? His own destruction? Or the truth of another? The air in the archive thickened as the lamp flickered. Lewis suggested we leave before the damp overcame both paper and lung. I closed the manuscript, reluctant but obedient to the shadows. We replaced it carefully, though I marked the shelf in memory. Some books resist removal. They prefer to remain where they are until their time is ready. Back above ground, the college seemed almost alive by comparison. The sound of footsteps echoing through the cloister, the smell of wet ivy sharp after the staleness below. I carried with me the image of the manuscript's underlined word, author, and the line about return. That night in my room, I attempted the crossword once more. A clue awaited me. In a dark vault, words survive what man forgets. 9. I wrote the answer slowly. 9 letters, exact, inevitable. The crossword was no longer a game. It had become a mirror. I poured whiskey, its warmth against the damp still in my bones, and thought again of Eleanor, of the blurred woman in the photograph, of the chalk upon her hands. The fellow had written of her return before it occurred. Or had he simply translated inevitability? The city outside was quiet, save for the occasional wheels of a bicycle against wet stone. I stared at the manuscript's empty envelope, now folded into my pocket, the seal broken, the initials present once again. A.R. They remained unsolved, yet they bound the fragments together like a refrain. I closed my eyes, and the line from the manuscript returned, softer, insistent. She returns, but the door remembers the silence. I wondered whether silence itself was the manuscript, written not in ink, but in absence, waiting patiently in the shadows until someone stubborn enough came to read it. Confessions arrive in Oxford more often than truths. The city has always bred men and women skilled in language, and language, in its slipperiness, lends itself easily to invention. A confession is rarely a mirror, it is a mask. It was late evening when Lewis and I were summoned back to St. Anselm's. The porter, grave as ever, informed us that one of the fellows had requested to speak with me. We found him in a small, windowless room off the cloister, a space meant for tutorials, its air thick with chalk dust, and the ghost of arguments long since abandoned. The man was the younger scholar I had observed at dinner, sharp-eyed, restless, his manner too precise to be casual. He gestured for us to sit, though he himself remained standing, pacing with the rhythm of a man rehearsing lines he had repeated many times in silence. At last he declared that he was responsible for the death. His words fell with the weight of finality, yet the silence that followed did not settle. It stirred. Lewis leaned forward, eager, his relief palpable. I, however, listened, with the patience born of disappointment already anticipated. The fellow described how he had quarrelled with the deceased over manuscripts, how tempers had flared, how he had administered poison into the man's tea. He spoke with fluency, but without pain. It was a narrative too complete, too polished. Confession should stumble. He did not. I asked him the simplest of questions. Why 11 minutes past 9? He blinked, uncertain. His account faltered. He murmured something about coincidence, about chance. Chance does not choose so exact a minute, nor does it halt a watch in a dead man's pocket at the same hour. His ignorance revealed itself in that hesitation, that single misstep. The mask slipped. Lewis frowned. His eagerness soured into suspicion. He pressed the fellow for detail. Which poison? Which bottle? Where had he acquired it? The answers came too easily, drawn from books rather than memory, rehearsed rather than lived. I watched his hands as he spoke. They were too steady, too clean. A murderer's hands should carry the tremor of what they have done, or the stain of what they cannot forget. He only performed. When he concluded, he waited as though for applause. I remained silent. Silence unsettles more than accusation. At last he asked whether I believed him. I told him I believed he wished to be believed. His face tightened. He muttered that he had done what had to be done, that he had rid the college of tyranny. His words, though vehement, rang hollow, like coins struck from base metal. Afterward, Lewis and I walked the cloister, the echo of our footsteps mingling with the faint drip of water from the eaves. He asked why a man would confess falsely. I replied that sometimes guilt is heavier for what one has not done than for what one has. To envy, to resent, to wish ill, these are weights enough to bend a conscience until it seeks punishment. Lewis shook his head, muttering that it made no sense. I told him that sense was a poor measure of truth. Back in my room, I considered the crossword once more. A clue waited for me like a companion. He admits what he never did. 5. The answer formed itself without a resistance liar. I wrote it in, the letters stark against the page. I thought then of Eleanor. She had not confessed, yet her silences had spoken louder than any words. And the will, its bequest, had pointed too directly toward her, too conveniently. A false confession and a false inheritance. Both red herrings, both designed to mislead. Yet between them, the real pattern persisted, like faint ink beneath layers of erasure. The whiskey in my glass grew warm as I turned the matter in my mind. Why choose to confess now? Why so rehearsed, so polished? Because he believed the story needed closure. He wished to write himself into the narrative, to be the author of its conclusion. Yet the true author remained elsewhere, still hidden, still patient. The rain returned, pattering against the window, its rhythm familiar, insistent. I thought again of the manuscript in the shadows, of the line underlined twice by the author, and of the watch arrested at 11 minutes past 9, as if to remind me that time itself was complicit in the deception. I set down the glass, extinguished the lamp, and sat in the dark. The false confession had not resolved the puzzle. It had only deepened it, adding another layer of silence to a story already thick with shadows. In Oxford, I had learned, truth never arrives announced. It waits, elusive, until one is weary enough to hear it. And I, weary though I was, knew I had not yet heard it. It was not the woman's face that unsettled me most in the photograph, but the shadow beside her. Until then, I had thought of her blurred outline as the only anomaly, the only intrusion upon the symmetry of scholars posed in their stiff arrangement. Yet one evening, when the lamp angled differently across my desk, I saw what I had missed. There was a shadow cast along the ivy wall behind her. It did not belong to her figure, nor to any of the scholars in the foreground. It fell at a slant, elongated, too angular to be natural. It was the shadow of someone else, someone absent from the frame, and yet undeniably there. Lewis, when I showed him, dismissed it at first. Trick of the light, he said, the distortion of old lenses, nothing more. But I knew the shadows. They are more honest than faces, more reliable than words. A face can lie, but a shadow cannot. We returned the photograph to the library, where the librarian regarded it with the same suspicion she had shown everything I carried. She told me it had been taken on a Thursday, the day of the Fellows' Cloister debates. That detail pressed against my thoughts with new insistence. Thursday. The day circled twice on the timetable pinned to the Fellows' wall. The pattern returned, insistent. As we studied the image, I asked her whether anyone had ever remarked on the figure in the background. She hesitated, adjusting her spectacles, and replied that there had been whispers that Eleanor had not been the only unexpected presence that afternoon. Whispers. Oxford thrives on them, yet rarely admits them aloud. Lewis grew impatient. He asked whether we were to chase shadows now, whether we would solve death with photographs. I told him that photographs were simply crosswords written in light, waiting for someone stubborn enough to complete them. He muttered under his breath, but said no more. Later in the Fellows' rooms, I sat again at his empty desk. The crossword fragments lay scattered before me. One clue had remained unsolved. Darkness reveals what brightness cannot. 6. The deceased had left it blank. I filled it in now with a single word shadow. The deduction seemed almost too simple, yet simplicity has its own eloquence. The fellow had been haunted by shadows in manuscripts, in crosswords, in photographs, and now his death was framed by them, as though the absence of light had been the only truth he could still trust. That evening, Eleanor visited me unannounced. She stood in the doorway of my room, rain clinging to her coat, her eyes bright with a fatigue that no sleep would cure. She asked whether I believed the will condemned her. I told her that wills condemn no one. She sat by the window, her hands folded tightly, and looked not at me, but at the city beyond. The silence stretched, carrying with it an unspoken confession. I asked her about that Thursday. She said she had been present, yes, though not in any official capacity. She had watched from the ivy wall, unseen by most, unacknowledged by all. She had been waiting for someone. I asked whom. Her silence was longer than the rain against the glass. When she finally spoke, she said only that the dead man had promised her something. She did not say what. When she left, the photograph remained on my desk, the shadow etched into my memory more deeply than before. It no longer seemed incidental. It seemed deliberate, as though the camera itself had been enlisted as a witness. I poured whiskey, the glass warm in my hand, and studied the image again. The shadow fell at a precise angle, sharper than the blur of the woman beside it. It seemed to lean forward, as though watching, as though listening. I thought of the handprint upon the library sill, the mud pressed faintly into stone. A watcher. Always a watcher. The bells rang out across the night, their sound soaked in drizzle. 11 minutes past the hour. Always that moment, repeated like a refrain. I set down the glass and leaned closer to the photograph, tracing the shadow with my finger. It ended not against the ivy, but against the fellow himself, as though it reached for him, claimed him. I closed my eyes then, weary, the rain whispering against the window pane. Confessions could be false, wills could mislead, but shadows could not be bribed. Somewhere within the blurred outline of that photograph lay the truth, concealed in silence, waiting. The crossword clue lingered in my mind. Darkness reveals what brightness cannot. Shadow. 6 letters, complete. And though the answer seemed too plain, I knew it was enough for now, enough to carry me into the next silence, the next corridor, the next inevitable return of rain on stone. The manuscript called me back as surely as bells summon a congregation. I had not intended to return to the archive so soon, yet its silence pressed upon me like a debt unpaid. The stairs descended into their familiar chill, each step a reminder that knowledge in Oxford so often lies below ground, half forgotten, deliberately buried. Lewis accompanied me reluctantly, his patience already strained by days of shadows, crosswords, and silences. He said he preferred the clarity of statements and fingerprints, of inked signatures and timetables. I told him clarity was the most dangerous of illusions. He muttered that I enjoyed illusions more than truth. Perhaps he was right. The lamp flickered as we entered. The shelves sagged in their usual indifference, but I walked straight to the place where the fellow's manuscript had waited. It remained there, plain-clothed and unobtrusive, as though no hand had touched it since ours. Yet when I opened it, I found a difference. A page had been removed, torn carefully, cleanly, without a ragged edge. Absence, once again, spoke louder than presence. Lewis demanded to know what had been taken. I told him that sometimes it is the missing verse that shapes the poem. He frowned and accused me of speaking in riddles. I reminded him that riddles are all we ever have. We studied what remained. The Latin text persisted, translated into the fellow's neat, uncompromising script: exile, return, silence, shadows. Over and over the words repeated themselves as though he had sought refuge in monotony. But in the margins of one page, pressed faintly, I saw an acrostic formed by the first letters of consecutive lines, A-R again. Always those initials, waiting like a shadow at the corner of sight. Lewis cursed under his breath. He said initials proved nothing. Yet his frustration revealed what I already knew. Repetition is its own proof. When a name insists on returning, it must be read. The air thickened, the damp rising from the stones until our breath seemed part of the archive itself. I ran my hand along the edge of the desk, feeling the grooves left by scholars long dead. And there, pressed faintly into the wood, I felt a mark I had not noticed before. A single word scratched in haste, author. I whispered it aloud, and the sound seemed to disturb the shadows. Author. The same word underlined in the manuscript, the same word that had emerged from the crosswords. Author of what? His own destruction, someone else's? Or was it a demand that the true author of the silence of the crime be revealed? We replaced the manuscript, though reluctantly, and climbed back into the damp corridors above. The cloister air was marginally warmer, though heavy with rain. Eleanor appeared there, as though summoned by our unease. She asked what we had found. I told her only that shadows persist even when light fades. She regarded me with weary eyes and said nothing further. That night in my room, I attempted once again the crossword that had resisted me. A clue I had avoided seemed suddenly urgent. Writer hidden in silence. 6. I wrote author, the letters sliding into place as though they had been waiting. The word completed not only the puzzle, but the rhythm that had echoed for days. I poured whiskey and let its warmth settle against the damp that still clung to my bones. The manuscript, the photograph, the will, the false confession, each had been an attempt at authorship, a narrative constructed, erased, rewritten. And through them all the initials returned, the shadow whispered, the silence endured. Oxford outside my window lay dark, its spires indistinct against the night sky. The rain pattered against stone, steady, inevitable, as though reciting a verse too old to forget. I sat in the quiet, the crossword solved but the truth unsolved, and wondered whether the manuscript in the shadows had been a warning, a confession, or a lure. What I knew was this: authorship is never innocent. To write is to arrange truth and falsehood into patterns that conceal as much as they reveal. The fellow had written his own silence, and in doing so had left us only fragments, initials, shadows. I had followed them, patient, weary, and found only that the answer lay still concealed. But perhaps that was all the manuscript had ever intended, not revelation. Only the persistence of shadow, the quiet insistence that what is hidden remains, waiting. And in the stillness of that night, with Oxford drowned again in rain, I felt the manuscript whisper, not solution, but endurance. Shadows survive, they always do. The bells of Oxford are rarely precise. They drift, they delay, they overlap each other in a chorus of dissonance that suits the city well. But at St. Anselm's the bell tolled differently. For days now I had felt its rhythm pressing upon me, always returning to that same fractured moment 11 minutes past the hour. Time had become less a measure than a signal, less a passing than a presence. Lewis and I stood beneath the tower that evening, the rain easing into mist, the air sharp with the smell of wet stone. The porter had told us that the mechanism was old, temperamental, and inclined to strike late. Yet when the bell rang at 11 minutes past, its voice was clear, deliberate, almost defiant. Not an accident. Ritual. I asked Lewis whether he recalled the watch in the fellow's pocket, arrested, at that very time. He muttered that he did, and that coincidence remained his preferred explanation. I told him coincidence was merely the disguise of a pattern. He sighed, weary of my insistence. The cloister was quiet, the lamps along its walls casting long, wavering shadows. We walked its length, our footsteps echoing in uneven counterpoint to the dripping of rain from the eaves. At one corner, near the ivy wall where the photograph had been taken, I stopped. The air felt heavier there, as though the stones themselves carried memory. I closed my eyes and listened. Somewhere, faintly, a step. Not ours. Not echo. A footfall withdrew quickly into silence. Lewis called out, but the cloister gave no reply. Oxford is skilled at swallowing sound. We returned to the fellow's rooms one final time. The desk remained immaculate, the matches still broken, the wastebasket still empty. Yet as I sat in his chair, the bells began again, marking the hour. 11 minutes past, always. And in that sound I heard not time, but intention. A man had ordered his life by minutes, by precise rituals, until death itself obeyed the rhythm. I examined once more the blurred note clutched in his hand when he was found. The ink had bled, the words obscured, but under the lamplight I thought I saw them resolve faintly into shape. Not a word, but two. Be still, or perhaps be silent. Silence was his last instruction, his last ritual. Lewis asked whether I finally understood. I told him understanding was overrated. We see fragments, never whole. He asked what remained to be done. I answered that nothing remained but to listen. That night, in my room, I returned to the crossword. One clue still awaited me. Time tolls after silence. 11. The answer arrived slowly, inevitably. 11 passed, 11 letters. The puzzle completed itself as though the deceased had set it for me alone. I poured whiskey and sat back, listening. Across the city, the bells rang faintly, their voices weaving through the damp night air. At St. Anselm's, I knew the tower bell would be striking again, not at the hour, but at its own chosen moment. 11 minutes passed, always 11 past. Oxford outside lay drowned in silence, the streets dark, the spires blurred by mist. I thought of Eleanor, of the blurred woman in the photograph, of the fellow who had ordered his life into rituals so precise that even death arrived punctually. The will, the false confession, the manuscript in the shadows, all fragments, all attempts at authorship, none complete, none final. I set the glass down and closed my eyes. In memory, the bell tolled again, patient, inevitable, reminding me that silence itself carries rhythm, that absence can be as precise as presence. 11 minutes passed, a refrain, a pattern, a shadow. And though the case would close in the records with names and signatures, in my memory it would remain unfinished, unresolved, suspended always at that moment when the bell tolled against the rain, carrying into silence a truth too fragile for words.